Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 6, and we're going to continue our discussion about corporations in particular. I've used the first couple of weeks of this unit to really go over in depth the differences between sole proprietorship, general partnership, corporation, S corporation, and limited liability company. But as we've alluded to throughout the last couple of weeks, and certainly as discussed in your book, the understanding of corporations requires some of its own attention because they are that much more complicated to form, to run, and to end. So I've devoted this week and next week to talking more about corporations in particular. So in this PowerPoint, I'm going to go over some of the highlights from your chapter, I believe it's 33. Don't quote me right now as I'm recording, but it's the chapter about sort of the birth and death of a corporation. So in order to do this, I'm going to use the example of me starting my own bakery, because as I think I've mentioned before, I believe I did, that in my hypothetical world, if I were to start my own business, it would definitely be a bakery. My younger son loves to bake, cooks all the time, and I think that that would be something that I would enjoy also, and including my late grandfather, who I never met, was actually a baker himself. So it's in our blood. But here I am, a lawyer, telling you about corporations instead. But back to my bakery. All right, so the first thing we have to talk about when we think about starting a corporation is to remind you of something that I said very early on in our process when we were first talking about sole proprietorships, and that someone could literally wake up one morning and say, I would like to start a business today, and just enter into her own business. I could start selling coffee mugs. I could start making jewelry. I could start a bakery. And if I do that without any appropriate paperwork, any filing with anything with the state, then I am a sole proprietorship. Very easy to start. Pretty much the exact opposite is true of a corporation. The beginning of a corporation actually starts months before, perhaps years before the actual incorporating of the business. And part of that is, of course, getting investors into your business, because, of course, the whole idea of building out a corporation is seeking those investors who then have the limited liability and will give you money to grow your corporation. But it's a little bit more than just, hey, do you want to invest in my company? Let's go back and think about the bakery, for example. If I am planning to open a bakery, let's say my target deadline is December 1 of a particular year, and I want to actually have the bakery open and up and running on that particular day, what do I need to have ready before that day so that I can have my grand opening on December 1st? Clearly, I need investors to help me fund it, or maybe I had a lot of money on my own. Maybe I also need a bank loan. But besides the financial piece, which is important, what else do I need? So pause the video for a second and think to yourself, what do I need to really have this business up and running? So if you've now paused it and come back, hopefully some things you've thought of would include an actual location. Do you want to rent or buy a building or a space where your your bakery would be located? What about things inside the bakery, like commercial grade ovens and sinks and refrigerators and freezers to prepare all the food and store it? What about tables and chairs and a cash register? How are you getting all of things? Are you buying them all ahead of time? Are you renting some of the equipment? What about employees? You also need to hire employees. So in just a matter of a couple of minutes, we've come up with a few different things that you would need to have going for you before you even start the business. And again, let's just use the example of a lease. Let's say you're renting commercial space, you're purchasing equipment, and you're buying tables and chairs, and you're hiring employees. At a minimum, that is what you would need. So if you're the one, and that the example I would use, it's me, if I'm the one getting my bakery up and running, but I'm not a corporation yet, I actually am called the promoter, kind of like a concert promoter that goes out and promotes the concert before it begins. I'm the promoter. I'm the one that is doing all of that back end work to get my bakery up and running. And this is really important because I want you to picture that timeline if you actually want to take out a piece of paper and write it down and work backwards. So December 1, you want to have your business up and running. At some point before that date, you need to fill out the proper paperwork for the state to become a corporation. But again, that takes time. We'll get back to the paperwork on another PowerPoint. But what about the signing of your lease What about the renting of equipment or purchasing of equipment? And this is really important. If you, as the promoter, the one starting your corporation, are entering into a commercial lease for the space of your bakery or my bakery before the date that you actually become incorporated, then you, as the promoter, are personally liable on that lease because there isn't a corporation yet. You're in the process of forming the corporation. So you might ask yourself, well, why don't I just wait until I'm incorporated and then the corporation will sign the lease? Because remember, corporations are their own legal entities, so they have the power to enter into a contract. So why not just wait until the corporation is formed? But think about it from a practical perspective. I'm sitting around and I'm forming my corporation, and all of a sudden, the most prime piece of real estate becomes available for my bakery. Maybe it's the perfect downtown location close to both public transportation, walking, businesses, homes, families, and also has a parking lot. Maybe it's available today on, just hypothetically, August 1st, but my corporation is not formed yet. Do I just have to sit back and say, oh, I don't want the business anymore. I don't want that location. I need to wait till I'm incorporated. No, as the promoter, I can enter into that contract. It's just that I'm going to be personally liable on that contract as the promoter until the corporation is formed. At that point, the corporation will enter into something called a novation, and then the corporation will take on that contract, and the corporation is responsible for it. This ties directly back to our concept of limited liability. I, as the promoter, don't want to be personally liable if the business can't pay its rent, right? The business should be liable. So I just wanted to go over that because from a practical perspective, if you're forming a corporation, this is some important information to know. I also put on this slide, but I won't have time. It'll take me, a couple of hours to make PowerPoints if I put all of this on here. But I do want you to look at the section of your book that talks about forming a corporation by mistake, or what happens if you have mistakes in the formation of the corporation. Does that mean you haven't formed one? Not necessarily. I also want to mention that the concept of corporation by estoppel is present here, just like it was for partnership by estoppel. Remember, if you outwardly represent to others that you are a corporation and they rely on that to their detriment, then the law will treat you as a corporation, even if you did not formally form one. Okay, so now we're talking about someone who has been the promoter. They're the ones that formed the corporation. Another important step to talk about in forming the corporation is choosing a state of incorporation. Now, you may remember something we talked about a couple of weeks ago is that corporate law is a creature of state law. That can be really overwhelming because that means there are 50 different sets of corporate laws all around the country. And that's true. There's not a national set of corporate law, except as it relates to tax law, but tax law is not all corporate law. It's just a piece of it. So there are federal taxes for corporations, but the bigger bulk of the law is all governed by state law. So how do you choose? When you incorporate, you have to choose one state of incorporation. How do you do that? You've got 50 states to choose from. Well, the answer is actually less complicated than you would think. The answer is most places of business choose their home state. So something that I think we will take time, I don't think I put it on this week's discussion board, but when I do a video on the Secretary of Commonwealth's website, I want to show you how to find out which corporations in Massachusetts are actually Massachusetts corporations, ones that were founded here, but are also headquartered here. If you do not choose your home state as your headquarters, then the other state most likely to be chosen is Delaware. I know that seems kind of random. It's this one very, very small state. We don't really think about it for too many other reasons, unfortunately, but it actually is the home to the bulk of corporate law. And that is because Delaware has their own court system, their own court that is dedicated to corporate law. So tying back to one of the reasons that many business entrepreneurs will choose a corporation, because there is a well-developed body of law that helps us understand how corporations work. Most of that law comes from Delaware. So choices are usually home state or Delaware. And on another video, I'll show you some of the incorporation for companies that you might think are in Massachusetts, but are actually headquartered in Delaware, even if they have their offices here. Okay, next up in developing the corporation is drafting a charter. This is like the document that says you are a corporation. So in some states, this document's called the charter. Some states it's called the Articles of Incorporation, and sometimes they can be called the Articles of Organization. Has to depend on the state. This is what I'm talking about with filing the documents with the state. The charter must contain certain information or the state won't recognize you as a corporation. The charter must contain the name of the company and it must be unique. You can't choose a name of an existing company. That won't work. You also have to provide an address for the business and somebody called a registered agent. A registered agent is a legal designation. Now, think back for a second about a corporation. If you had, I don't know, let's say a slip and fall lawsuit against McDonald's or Target or Walmart, who do you sue? How do you let McDonald's know that they've been sued? How do you let Target know you're suing them? You can't just walk into your local Target and ask for the general manager, right? So the registered agent is the name of a person who's connected with the corporation who can receive legal documentation related to lawsuits or other legal matters. So you can look that up. That's publicly available information because you're not, if you slip and fall in McDonald's, you don't have to go around, figure out who the president, vice president, managers of all the McDonald's are. You would look up the registered agent of McDonald's and send your legal documents to that person. It doesn't mean you're suing that person. He's just the person. He's the agent, the one who's authorized to sort of receive all that legal information. So you need the name, the address, the registered agent. The charter must be signed by the incorporator. Sometimes that's actually the attorney, the one that helped prepare the documents. So every single state requires this from corporations. Other information that must be included in a charter is information pertaining to stock. Now, your book goes into several paragraphs, a whole section on the breakdown of stock, and I'm not going to give you a lot of test questions on how stock works. But I do want you to have a general idea that the idea of issuing stock is something that is tied to the charter itself. A company can't just say, oh, I'm a corporation. Now I want to issue shares of stock. It doesn't work that way. It has to be, and by the word it, I mean the number of shares of stock. And stock is another word for ownership interest in the company. The number of shares of stock must be designated in the charter. It can't be up to the corporation later to say, we change our minds, we want to issue more stock, or we want to buy back some of our stock. If that happens, then the corporation has to amend its charter. So I do want you to understand that the idea of how many shares a company decides to issue is tied directly to how many shares of stock are authorized in the charter. And that can be amended later, but that's very important for a company when it's establishing itself. The company also can set the par value, which is the minimum price of the shares of stock. In today's modern world, we set the par value at like a penny a share. It's more of a historical significance, but that is something that still has to be in the charter. And something else to keep in mind, the more shares a company would like to issue in its company, the higher the filing fee with the state. This ties back to something else we talked about, which is it's expensive to form a corporation. I do want you to take a minute. I won't spend my PowerPoint time going over it, but going over the different classes of stock, preferred and common stock. But I see that I'm at 15 minutes. So I'm going to pause this video and I'm going to make part 2, but I'm going to pick up with this slide just so we can say a little bit more about stock before I finish up.